It's interesting to have your entire history just rolled out like that. But I will say this. Switzerland, Italy, Canada, Jamaica, 2 presidents, U2, Pearl Jam, Led Zeppelin, 300 employees, $22 million in sales, and the privilege to cook in one of the greatest food cities in the world is where food has taken me. But when I was sitting in your seat a little bit ago, I would have never picked this as a career path. I wouldn't have even envisioned it as a possibility. When I was here, I think maybe the definition of success was you were either going to be a doctor or a lawyer. And a lot of decisions through high school and even into college, I think I had one very specific vision of what success was, and I pursued it vigorously. So a lot of those bullet points Mr. Grau went through are true. I was in all honors, National Honor Society, National Merit semifinalist, great GPA, full scholarship to college. I took 2 dead languages. I took Latin and ancient Greek because that would help you score better on college entrance exams and the MCAT. And I did. I went to University of Alabama and immediately got into a pre-med program, studied biology, got a biology degree, studied philosophy as well, got a philosophy degree, took the MCAT, scored well on that, got an interview to go to LSU Medical School, went on the interview, and then went home and told my parents I was going to culinary school instead. But how did I get to that point, I think, in my life where I was on one very distinct path with a very clear vision of what it was going to be like for me to be successful? What you don't know is that I was a busboy at Tony Angelo's at 14 years old. I was a waiter on the lakefront at 3 different restaurants by the time I was 17. I cooked all through college at Alabama. And summers I would come home and work for really famous New Orleans chefs because I really liked it. You know, my parents made me work, which was great. Mr. Grau was actually technically my first boss. I think I was like 12 years old. I was a camp counselor at St. Pius. He paid me $50 a week. But I've worked my whole life. I worked a couple of nights a week, even when I was at Jesuit from sophomore year on. I worked every summer, and I worked in restaurants. And I worked in restaurants because they paid well. I made a lot of cash, good spending money, and I enjoyed it a lot. A huge creative outlet. I loved meeting people from such diverse backgrounds. And when it came time for me to make that decision of, am I going to go, do I really want to go to medical school? Do I really want 4 more years of college, of intense studying? Or do I want to do something that I've been doing now for 6, 7, 8 years, and I love every minute of it? So I went home and said, I'm not going to medical school, I'm going to culinary school. And in that moment, I think my dad, who doesn't typically say much, gave me some of the best advice I've ever received. And all he said was, that's fine, but pursue food like you would medicine. And, you know, moments like that, I think now you reflect on and you realize what a poignant moment it was that he would have the wherewithal to say something like that in that moment. And I don't think it hit as hard then as it does now. But that single moment, I think, has for sure guided me along the path. Because when you read back with the clarity that the 2020 vision of looking backwards gives you, it feels all very deliberate. But even to this day, I can't tell you that I know clearly what path I'm on. There are times in my life when I've made very deliberate decisions, like, no, I'm not going to culinary school. No, I'm not going to medical school. But there's other times where it's not deliberate, where an opportunity arises. But what I took as pursue food like you would medicine has a lot more to do with the journey than the end point. And so I think it's important when you sit in this room and we talk to you about what career path are you on, you don't need all the answers. I'm 41, I still don't have all the answers. And I still don't know necessarily with clarity what my next step is, but I pursue it. I prepare for the next step all the time. With the insight of looking back, should I have taken ancient Greek instead of Spanish? Spanish would really help me in the kitchen today. But all of my schooling, my biology degree, my philosophy degree, they all still help and helped form where I am today. They trained my brain to work a certain way, to critically think. So I don't have regret that, man, if I would have known I was going to be a chef, I would have gotten a business degree instead of a philosophy degree. None of that really matters, I don't think. I think I pursued all of those things with vigor. I got great grades. I studied hard. I still study hard. I buy books. I buy magazines. I interact with people. I do all of those things Mr. Grouse said. But I think the journey is just as important as knowing what the end goal is, and how you handle yourself and how you pursue things will very much play a role in where you get. So if you don't have the answer today, you don't have to. When I mention that there's times I've been very deliberate and sometimes doors just open, a couple of examples. When I chose to go to culinary school, I started to pick very deliberately what chefs I wanted to work for and that I wanted to work with. And when I moved to Charleston, there was one chef I wanted to work for, and his name was Bob Wagner, and he was kind of the big chef in Charleston at the time, and I interviewed and got a job. And while cooking with Chef Bob in Charleston, we used to do this visiting chef series in the summer. And one of the visiting chefs was from New Orleans, who's an old Frenchman named Rene Bajou. And he came to Charleston for the weekend. And so since I was from New Orleans and he was in New Orleans, they partnered us up. And in that weekend, he offered me a job to go open a restaurant with him in New Orleans. So while in Charleston, I wasn't thinking about moving back to New Orleans at the time, but I was working hard, I was doing a good job, and then a job to move back home, to be with my family, opens up, so I take it. And from then on, I was very deliberate about who I wanted to work for and why. And that led me to, I was a chef at Ralph's on the Park, right near here. And actually, the day before Katrina, I was interviewing to become the executive chef of Ralph's on the Park. And part of that interview process, the last step, was I had to cook a 5-course meal for the executive board of the Ralph Brennan Group. So there's a hurricane coming, and I'm in the second floor of the restaurant cooking this elaborate 5-course meal to hopefully become the chef of Ralph's on the Park. And did the interview. They didn't give me an answer that day because of the hurricane. The next day, city gets wiped out, right? That job was never offered to me. Even though I'd interviewed for it, so many things changed. But what was offered to me was to become the executive chef of the new Galatoire's in Baton Rouge. On Thanksgiving Day, I got a call that they wanted me to be the chef to open Galatoire's in Baton Rouge since the New Orleans property was closed. So I took it. It seemed like the most stable, safe thing to do in the world. I had a 10-week-old son at the time and made a very deliberate decision to go into business with the Galatoire family, which then turned into me running 2 Galatoires, one in Baton Rouge. We reopened New Orleans, and for 6 years, worked at one of the most famous restaurants in the world and ran the kitchen, and it's one of the most magical, I think, food experiences. If you haven't been, you should go. And the whole time I was there, though, I was always preparing for the next step, not necessarily knowing what that was. The further I got into food, the more I realized I probably wanted to be in business for myself instead of working for someone else. A couple of opportunities came up. I did leave Galatoire's after another natural disaster, well, not natural, but another disaster, the BP oil spill, and took a job to represent the state of Louisiana because everyone was afraid to eat the seafood. And there was a ton of science behind why our seafood was safe to eat. So all of a sudden, I'm going on trips with fishermen, and we're doing biological experiments on fish to determine if they're contaminated with oil, if the water that they're swimming in is safe. And all of a sudden, all of the biology comes back, and it's useful again. And it helped me go all across the country with confidence and say, all of this seafood that is making it to your plate from the Gulf is safe. So the preparation, the journey, ended up being very fruitful. The next major step was partnering with Chef John Besh. And that was a very great, deliberate decision again, because his vision for how restaurants should work for cooks was eventual ownership of your own company. And so I partnered with him in 2012, and we opened Bourne Restaurant together. We're still partners today. But he made me a partner in the restaurant, which, picking cooking, which starts off at $10, $11 an hour, to owning your own business, that's a really intense, long journey. But I started to figure it out along the way, which has now led to me owning 3 companies with 300 employees. And if Mr. Wright's around, he would be proud. In calculus class, whenever we solved an equation, he would write on the board QED, the Latin for quod erat demonstratum, which means this is the proof, thus it's been demonstrated. The name of my company now is QED Hospitality, because this is the proof of what it means to be hospitable. And so little nuggets from the journey, from being here at Jesuit, from studying Latin, to a biology degree, all of those things, I think, are now what is my career path. But I still don't have all the answers. I still can't tell you today what the next step for my new company is. But I'm always preparing and always pressing forward with vigor and studying and meeting people and volunteering and doing things like this, because I think the journey is just as important as the end game. That's the story.